Okay, we're live.
Hi everyone, I'm Lydia Kerr from the Department of English and Literature, and I'm one of the primary organizers of this event series. Before we begin, I want to tell those of you watching via live stream a bit about the structure of our proceedings this afternoon. This virtual speaker series on Mormonism and the challenges of whiteness is an academic project in which about 10 UVU students read and study some of the most current work by leading scholars on the series' core theme in advance of each scholar's virtual presentation. These students are here today in our designated Zoom meeting, and their questions will be prioritized during the discussion following our speaker's presentation. I'll be monitoring this discussion and monitoring the event's live stream for any questions those of you watching on YouTube might have. If you can type them into the chat window besides the video, I'll ask them on your behalf. And I promise I'll do my best to include as many of these questions as possible, but because this series is designed as an engaged learning activity for our students, and because we intend for our conversation to surround the scholarly materials under consideration, I may not get to your remarks. Please know, however, that we're very grateful for your attendance and participation, and we're excited to have you at this, our second event in the series. I also want to take a minute to thank the other members of the organizing committee, Professors Brianne Matheson and Boyd Peterson in the Department of English and Literature, Professor Brian Birch from Philosophy and Religious Studies and Director of the Center for the Study of Ethics, also Evan Jones for his technical support today, and finally, Professor Nathan Gorelick from the English and Literature Department, to whom I now turn over the proceedings so he can introduce our featured scholar.
Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor W. Paul Reeve, the Simmons Professor of Mormon Studies in the History Department at the University of Utah, where he also received his PhD and has been teaching since 2005. In addition to serving as the general editor of a new online database, Century of Black Mormons, Professor Reeve's publication record is about as long as the Mormon Pioneer Trail, but a few highlights are worth noting. He is the author of 3 books: A Century of Enterprise, The History of Enterprise, Utah, 1896 to 1996, published by the City of Enterprise. And excuse me, but I've been to Enterprise and might dispute its designation as a city. At its most recent count, its total population was 1,711, which I know constitutes a roaring metropolis as far as the southwestern corner of the state is concerned. But I bring this up only to emphasize Professor Reeve's profound sense of place, his canny ability to enliven even the remote corners of American history with precisely that, their historicity, their importance to the unfinished American story. Here and in his other works, Professor Reeve's patient excavation of the archive and exacting and exact analysis stitches together narratives within narratives, a kind of mise en abîme, window into history of which there is no outside, no all-knowing eye of truth, a window within which the historian himself appears as one of the narrative's characters, if not exactly central, then nevertheless at the margin upon which he builds his frame. His second book, Making Space on the Western Frontier, Mormons, Miners, and Southern Paiutes, brings this same talent for enframing to bear upon the same contested space occupied in part by Enterprise, Utah today, a land upon which has been carved the struggle of Mormon pioneers to impose their sacred vision with and against the sacred vision of the Paiute people they found there, and the violence of a mineral extraction industry that values the earth only as a dead thing, pulverized or rent asunder, reduced to the wholly estimable price of a commodity to be consumed. Here, as elsewhere, Professor Reeve makes clear that history is no fairy tale. There may be victims and villains, but there are no wizards and no dragons, and nobody views themselves acting on the wrong side of good and evil. Nowhere is this complexity and moral ambiguity made more clear than in the book which is the subject of today's event, Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, which, since its publication in 2015 by a little-known publishing house at an obscure institution, the Oxford University Press, has won Best Book Awards from the Mormon History Association, the John Whitmer Historical Association, and the Utah State Historical Society. Since, as I say, this is the cornerstone of today's conversation, I will sidestep any summary and conclude by noting enthusiastically that Professor Reeve is also a celebrated and multiple award-winning teacher, who therefore gives the lie to the tired, stale, false, and unproductive dichotomy between scholarly and pedagogical commitment and excellence. We and our students are fortunate and grateful to welcome him to UVU. Professor Reeve.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate that, Dr. Gorlick, and thank you to Dr. Kerr and to the rest of the organizers, Dr. Birch, for the invitation to share with you some of my research. I'm just going to share my screen here and use that to just walk you through some of the research around whiteness that I have studied over the last decade or so. And the title of my remarks today are taken from Professor Francis Lieber, who we'll talk about here in just a minute. But to frame the discussion today, I wanted to just make a point that I'm sure if you're not already, you will be by the end of this series, be aware of that for as much as, the historical understanding of race was grounded in a sense of biology. Obviously, scholars for a long time have argued that race is rather than something biological. It's something social, something that we have constructed to or created or imagined in our minds to differentiate between ourselves, to make sweeping generalizations and to talk about different groups in different ways. I would like for us to think about race as something that is both ascribed from the outside in this social construct, as well as race that is aspired to from within. And I think that the Latter-day Saints story does a great job of illustrating this dynamic. Race that is something ascribed from the outside, meaning outsiders looking in on a particular group and ascribing racial characteristics to it. And also a negotiation in terms of those on the inside of that group aspiring to a racial identity of their own. And I think the Latter-day Saints story does a great job of illustrating this. My presumption is that most of those you will listen to in this series will focus more on the way that Latter-day Saints have tried to define race from within. My scholarship adds that other component, the way that outsiders looked from the outside in on Mormons and tried to ascribe a racial identity for them. And so most of my remarks are going to focus on the way that outsiders looked on the Latter-day Saints and ascribed a racial identity for them. So I'm going to start with Francis Lieber. He was a professor of history and political economics at South Carolina College, University of South Carolina today, in 1855, when he wrote an article for Putnam's Monthly. Now, it wasn't a signed article, meaning that his name was not on it, but I looked at his papers at the Huntington Library, and in his papers, he takes credit for this article, and I think it's easily verifiable that he wrote this article. And it's simply titled, "The Mormons, Shall Utah Be Admitted to the Union?" And Professor Lieber's answer is a resounding no. He is warning the nation that Utah will be applying for statehood and that the nation, Congress, should adamantly resist Utah's admission into the Sisterhood of States. What I'm really interested in is his reasons for making this argument. He argued that Utah would introduce a foreign and disturbing element into the Sisterhood of States. What does he mean by that? He says that there are two key elements at play, polygamy and politics. And he defines both of those as racial in the 19th century. He said that monogamy and republicanism were both racial and the preserves of European civilization. Now, for the political argument, this is an argument that other politicians have made in the 19th century. For example, John C. Calhoun on the floor of the United States Senate in 1848 said that democracy is the government of a white race. He had argued that only those who are Anglo-Saxon, those who are white, are capable of participating in democracy. Other societies who are not white are incapable of democracy. They are racially, biologically incapable of participating in democracy. And so Lieber buys this argument, and he makes the case that republicanism is a preserve of European civilization, but he also suggests that monogamy is as well. He said that monogamy goes beyond our religion. It is a law written in the heart of our race. So he acknowledges that Latter-day Saints defended polygamy as a religious principle and argued that, in fact, the Constitution protected it under the Free Exercise Clause. However, he rejects that argument and says that, in fact, monogamy and polygamy are racial, not merely religious. It goes beyond our religion, he says. Monogamy is the special domain of the Western Caucasian, according to Professor Lieber, and was one of the pre-existing conditions of our existence as civilized white men. So monogamy is white to Professor Lieber, and polygamy is Asiatic. And other scholars will make a similar argument. It's either Asiatic or African. No white societies participate in polygamy. Therefore, if you are performing polygamy, if you're engaging in polygamy, your whiteness is in question. You're not white and you're not civilized. And what was really at play amongst these thinkers was the development theory that operated in the 19th century. The development theory simply suggested that all societies go through three stages of development. They begin in savagery, they transition to or progress to barbarism, and then from barbarism to civilization. As they do so, they leave the markers of savagery and barbarism behind. And a couple of those markers are adherence to despotic rule and polygamy. And the argument was that Anglo-Saxons, as they progressed from savagery to barbarism and barbarism to civilization, they left behind adherence to despotic rule and abandoned polygamy. So the preserves of civilization are monogamy and republicanism or democracy. The fear was that you look in on these group of religious zealots in the American West, and they represent a deterioration away from civilization. They are going backward along this line, backward into barbarism and into savagery. They are ostensibly white. They may look white, but they are not performing whiteness. So therefore, their whiteness is suspect. Let me just give you some evidence to substantiate this. Dr. Roberts Bartholow is a medical doctor with the U.S. Army who observes the Latter-day Saints as a part of the Utah War. He is stationed in Utah for a couple of years and writes a report to the United States Senate in 1860 about his observations. And in his argument, he suggests that polygamy is giving rise to a new race. He said that the Mormon of all the human animals now walking this globe is the most curious in every relation. He called Mormonism a great social blunder which seriously affected the physical stamina and mental health of its adherents. He suggested that polygamy was a central issue because it created a preponderance of female births. His argument was you have one man and then several women in a marital relationship, and the offspring will be a preponderance of female children. He also argued that it gives rise to high infant mortality, and it produces a striking uniformity in facial expression, which included albuminous and gelatinous types of constitution and physical conformation among the younger portion of Mormons. In his estimation, Latter-day Saints unduly interfered with the normal development of adolescence and was in sum a violation of natural law. He said that Mormon men constantly sought out young virgins, so that notwithstanding the preponderance of the female population, a large percentage of the young men remained unmarried. Girls were married to the waiting patriarchs at the earliest manifestations of puberty, and when that wasn't soon enough, he said that Mormons made use of somehow unspecified means to hasten the period. He said that the progeny of the peculiar institution demonstrated its most deplorable effects in the genital weakness of the boys and young men. He actually argues that polygamy will solve itself in a few generations because it's creating sterility in the next generation. The problem is that Latter-day Saints are too successful at winning converts from outside, and so it brings an influx of new genes into the gene pool, and it perpetuates the Mormon problem several generations. But nonetheless, he argues that polygamy is creating a sexual debility in the next generation of Mormon men, largely because he says their sexual desires are stimulated to an unnatural degree at a very early age. And as female virtue is easy, opportunities are not wanting for their gratification. So all of this in his mind is creating a degraded Mormon body and giving rise to a new race. And he describes this degraded Mormon body. He says it's an expression of countenance and a style of feature which may be styled the Mormon expression and style, an expression compounded of sensuality, cunning suspicion, and smirking self-conceit. The yellow sunken cadaverous visage, the greenish colored eyes, the thick protuberant lips, the low forehead, the light yellowish hair, and the lank angular person constitute an appearance so characteristic of the new race, the production of polygamy, as to distinguish them at a glance. You can tell a Mormon when you see one, in other words. And in his estimation, the degradation of the mother follows that of the child, and physical degeneracy is not a remote consequence of moral depravity. His argument is that Mormonism is giving rise to a new degenerate race in the American West, and polygamy is producing this degeneration. So a backward descent from civilization, backward into barbarism and savagery. And this isn't just merely a stodgy old Senate report filed away in the United States Senate, never heard from again. In fact, it's picked up uncritically by a variety of medical journals. This is just an indication of the timeline from 1860 to 1867, the various places where I found it republished. We'll focus in on December of 1860 because the New Orleans Academy of Sciences actually has a conference on the degraded Mormon body. And a variety of medical doctors attend this conference, and they publish their proceedings. All of the doctors but one buys Bartholow's arguments and pushes it forward. One doctor, however, suggests, Mormonism has only been around for 30 years. It's too early to suggest that it's giving rise to a new race. We needed to study it empirically for at least another 30 years before we could clearly decide that a new race was arising in the American West as a result of the practice of polygamy. All the other medical doctors bought Bartholow's argument and actually pushed it forward. So it has influence, in other words, and it suggests a way of looking at Mormonism from the outside looking in. Another medical doctor, Dr. Charles Furley, also visits Utah, and he publishes his own version in 1863 of what he believes is going on in Utah Territory and arrives at a similar conclusion. These are just a couple of quotes from Furley's report. He says, a marked physiological inferiority strikes the stranger from the first as being one of the characteristics of this people. A certain feebleness and emaciation of person is common amongst every class, age, and sex. In the faces of nearly all, one detects the evidences of conscious degradation or the bold and defiant look of habitual and hardened sensuality. There's a general lack of color, the cheeks of all being sallow and cadaverous, indicating an absence of good health. The eye is dull and lustreless, the mouth almost invariably coarse and vulgar. In fact, the features, the countenance, the whole face, where the divinity of man should shine out, is mean and sensual, to the point of absolute ugliness. So there's this very physical degradation that the medical community is arguing is taking place amongst the Latter-day Saints. Like Bartholomew, Furley's article is also picked up by a variety of medical journals and republished in 1863 and 1864. The other point that I want to make is the fact that this has an influence on the way that Latter-day Saints are viewed, even by the highest court of the United States. So this argument that polygamy is somehow racial is also picked up in the Reynolds decision. It's the first time that the Supreme Court adjudicates the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, and it's a polygamy test case. Latter-day Saints, once again, are arguing that polygamy is a religious principle protected under the free exercise clause. Chief Justice Morrison Waite, in the Reynolds decision in 1879, if you remember the Reynolds decision, it splits hairs in terms of what the Constitution actually protects in terms of religious liberty. It says that the Constitution protects your religious belief, but not religious practice, meaning you can believe in polygamy all you want, you just can't practice it. But a part of the argument that Morrison Waite draws upon originates with Francis Lieber back in 1855. And he actually cites Lieber by name in the Reynolds decision. And remember, Lieber was arguing that polygamy is racial. Monogamy is racial. Monogamy is the preserve of the white race. Polygamy is Asiatic and African. And Chief Justice Morrison Waite agrees with that and includes that as a part of his justification for ruling against the Latter-day Saints in the Reynolds decision. Polygamy, he says, has always been odious among the northern and western nations of Europe, and until the establishment of the Mormon Church was almost exclusively a feature of the life of Asiatic and African peoples. And he develops this argument and draws upon Lieber in making his case. Okay, so with that is just a little bit of background then, I just wanted to maybe talk about the ways that polygamy is imagined racially in the 19th century. And I'll focus in on two of those ways. One of them is white slavery, sort of thinking about Latter-day Saint polygamy as a version of white slavery in the 19th century. And I know it's really shocking, or at least it was for me when I was doing the research, that those in the 19th century actually argued that it's a more degraded version of slavery than that practiced by enslavers in the American South before the Civil War. The argument was that at least enslavers in the American South had the good sense to enslave racially inferior people, meaning that white people were enslaving racially inferior Black people. White slavery as practiced by the Latter-day Saints was worse in their estimation because it was white people enslaving white people. It's a violation of the very definition of whiteness. And so the suggestion is that they can't actually be white because they are engaging in a form of slavery. So white people enslaving white people, but it calls their whiteness into question. And that's what white slavery actually means. It's not accepting the whiteness, but suggesting that to be a true Anglo-Saxon, you would never engage in enslaving another white person. And so we see this theme across the course of the 19th century, imagining Latter-day Saint polygamy as a version of white slavery, meaning that Latter-day Saint women were held captive in a system against their will. 1855, a dime novel called Bodacia, the Mormon Wife, is one example of this. It simply suggests that Mormon women are treated as but little better than slaves. They are in fact white slaves, are required to do all the most servile drudgery, are painfully impressed with their nothingness and utter inferiority in divers ways and at all seasons, and are frequently subjected to personal violence and various modes of corporal punishment. Alfred Trumbull's The Mysteries of Mormonism, published in 1881, includes this illustration, just simply titled Wives as Slaves. And this becomes a popular theme in the 19th century in political cartoons and illustrations in dime novels across the course of the 19th century. So you can see then it's a stereotypical scene from the plantation South. The argument was that the Civil War got rid of one version of slavery, but Latter-day Saints are practicing a more degraded version of slavery in the American West. And some of the arguments are that it's going to take this same level of violence to get rid of it. This one is published in 1882 as Congress is debating the Edmonds Act, Congress trying to ratchet up the pressure. Remember, the Edmonds Act will define a new crime of unlawful cohabitation, which will actually start to produce convictions. No longer do you have to produce that or prove that a plural marriage has taken place. You just simply have to substantiate that a man has cohabited with more than one woman. So as Congress is debating this bill, Frank Leslie's Illustrated publishes this political cartoon simply called Women's Bondage in Utah, the Mormon Solution of the Cheap Labor Question. And we can sort of zero in here on the upper right-hand corner of the illustration. It gives an indication of the popular ways that outsiders imagined Latter-day Saint polygamy, the process to actually take place in the 19th century. So here they imagine the Mormon agent's delusive bait. So the bearded Mormon is in Europe, seducing young women into to join the LDS faith, and then seduce them out west, where they'll be funneled into the harem of a waiting patriarch. So you can see the trap then is the promise of a happy home out west, but the steel jaws are labeled polygamy and degradation. And then if we look at the rest of the political cartoon, you can see the ball and chain of one of the women is sealed and the other one is ignorance. And they are wearing wooden shoes, once again, to highlight their foreignness. Latter-day Saints are going to Europe and they're preying upon these unsuspecting women and channeling them into a form of white slavery in the American West. They are held prey to the slave driver, who is their husband, by the whip of intimidation, and all he's interested in is the profits by making them work. And you also then have the black man there in the background with the Emancipation Proclamation tucked under his shoulder. The implication here is that black men are more free than Mormon women in this white slavery in the American West. This pamphlet is published in 1884, which once again picks up on the same theme. It's simply called USA Uncle Sam's Abscess or Hell Upon Earth. And it once again picks up on this theme of white slavery. Utah's white slaves pitifully cry, "Wake up and free us." America talks in her sleep and answers, "No. White trash ain't so important as the N-word. Oh, Americans, chop your liberty poles into kindling wood or wake up and free your white slaves in the West. held now in slavery of body and soul worse than ever existed in the South and far more filthy. And once again, that's the point that I was making, is just simply that the argument was that it's a more degraded form of slavery than that was practiced in the American South. Again, when Congress is debating the Edmonds Tucker Act in 1887, the theme resurfaces in this political cartoon published in Puck in March of 1887, simply called An Interrupted Idyll, Danger Impending to the System of Woman Slavery in Utah. And you have the Mormon patriarch this time, sitting under the tree taking a rest. He holds in his hand the Book of Mormon, and the wives are out in the field working as slaves. And the shadow that's coming, or the cloud that's coming, is Edmunds' Law. It comes to be called the Edmonds Tucker Act as it passes Congress. But that's supposed to solve this problem of white slavery in the American West. And then the other theme that is popularized in political cartoons is just simply the notion of racial degeneration. So we talked about Bartholomew and Furley's medical assessments of polygamy. The popular imagination also picks up on this. And it's really important then to understand that as outsiders are looking in and ascribing a racial identity onto the Latter-day Saints, their suggestion is that Mormon polygamy is not merely destroying the traditional family, it's destroying the white race. And fear of race mixing permeates American society in the 19th century. Most states have laws against race mixing that would have prevented, legally, should have prevented these type of marriages taking place. So the suggestion is that Latter-day Saints are actually allowing what the rest of white society knows should be prevented. And they're darkening the white race, making it unfit for democracy. So it's not merely a suspect religious group that's at stake, but in fact, America's democracy that is at stake in the minds of outsiders. So this cartoon, or this illustration, is published in John Sherwood's A Comic History of the United States in 1870. And it has the enfeebled male patriarch out front, the long string of wives, and then the seemingly endless string of children. But it's not the number of wives and children that we should really pay attention to, but it's the de facto interracial nature of this imagined Latter-day Saint family. So you have a stereotypical mammy from the plantation South imagined as one of the wives, an Asian wife, and a Pacific Islander or Native American wife. So once again, Latter-day Saints facilitating race mixing and darkening the white race, making it unfit for democracy. This fear is also projected into Brigham Young's family itself. In 1872, he's arrested and hauled off to court on charges of lascivious cohabitation. The charges eventually get thrown out, but nonetheless, it becomes political fodder for political cartoons across the nation. And Frank Ledley's Budget of Fun publishes this cartoon, imagining what the scene must have looked like as Brigham Young is hauled off to court. It's simply called Affecting Parting of Brigham Young from His Interesting Little Family. But what's so interesting about Brigham Young's family? Once again, it's the imagined interracial nature of that family. So you have the very first wife reaching out to him is another black mammy from the plantation South, another black wife, imagined interracial children. And then even if you look at some of the white wives and children, if you're familiar with the way that sometimes Irish immigrants were drawn by political cartoonists in the 19th century with simian or ape-like features, you have the political cartoonists doing the very same thing here. So the suggestion is that in Brigham Young's very own family, he's presiding over the degradation of the white race. Racial deterioration and degradation are bound up in Latter-day Saint polygamy, in other words. Most of the political cartoons that I found had the white male and then the interracial wives. This one, however, turns that suggestion around. This is published in The Mysteries of Mormonism in 1881. And I think it's important to situate this in in time or chronologically. Remember, after 1877, federal troops have been withdrawn from the American South and Reconstruction is over. And Southerners are reasserting, white Southerners are reasserting white supremacy. And Black men could be and were lynched in the American South during this period for looking at a white woman incorrectly. So the suggestion here is that Latter-day Saints accept what the rest of white society knows should be forbidden. A Black man marrying even two white women. Okay, so that fear of race mixing, but the suggestion here is that the Black man is a Mormon and Mormons allow a Black man to look at a white woman in this way. All the way up through the turn of the 20th century. The last example I found was this sheet music published by Saul Bloom's Publishing House in New York. The song was actually performed on Broadway. It was billed as one of his hits for 1905. And it centers on making fun of or degrading Black people as well as Latter-day Saints. Coon songs were a popular form of music genre from the 1880s through the 1920s that played up racial stereotypes against Black people. But in this situation, the stereotypes are aimed at both Black people as well as Mormons. The chorus for the Mormon coon goes like this. I've got a big brunette and a blonde pet. I've got him short, fat, thin, and tall. I've got a Cuban gal and a Zulu pal. They come in bunches when I call. And that's not all. I've got him pretty too, got a homely few. I've got him black to octoroon. I can spare 6 or 8. Shall I ship them by freight? For I am the Mormon coon. So once again, that fear of race mixing being projected onto the Latter-day Saints. So let me just then shift gears just briefly to talk about race as aspiration then. So up to this point, I've been talking about the way that race was ascribed from the outside, outsiders looking in and ascribing a degenerate racial identity onto the Latter-day Saints. Let me just briefly suggest then that Latter-day Saints respond to this, I believe, out of an effort at aspiring towards whiteness for themselves. So their whiteness is called into question. The most significant way you claim whiteness for yourself in the 19th century is in distance from Blackness. And I see the Latter-day Saints doing that across the course of the 19th century, moving away from their own Black converts, putting race-based priesthood and temple restrictions in place, solidified by the beginning of the 20th century. Let me just share a little bit of evidence on that point, and then I think we can open it up for questions and answers. So Elijah Abel is the most well-documented Black priesthood holder in 19th century Latter-day Saint history. And you can see the dates. He's ordained an elder in January 1836. Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of the faith, sanctions this priesthood ordination with his signature a couple of months later. He's then ordained a member of the third quorum of the LDS 70. It's a missionary quorum in the 19th century. Also in 1836, he receives initial temple rituals in the Kirtland Temple and performs baptisms for the dead, another temple ritual in Nauvoo. So those are just indications of the open racial vision in a couple of founding decades of the Latter-day Saint movement. But by the beginning of the 20th century, then, I think these racial restrictions, how do you claim whiteness for yourself? Well, in distance from Blackness. And I think that is solidified in 1908 under then leader of the faith, Joseph F. Smith. He is Joseph Smith's nephew, Hiram Smith's son, and he's leading the faith in 1908. And we see actually a deterioration of the way that he thinks about Elijah Abel across the course of the 19th century, and Elijah Abel as a Black priesthood holder, I should say. In 1879, he actually defended Abel's priesthood as valid. In 1895, he reminded LDS leaders that Abel was ordained to the priesthood at Kirtland under the direction of the prophet Joseph Smith. In 1904, however, the slippage began. He called Abel's ordination a mistake that was never corrected. And then in 1908, he claimed that Abel's priesthood ordination was declared null and void by the prophet Joseph Smith himself. So in that act, in that moment of false memory in 1908, Joseph F. Smith puts the priesthood and temple restrictions in place from the beginning. He creates a new memory for the 20th century. In that new memory, the priesthood and temple restrictions had always been in place. Priesthood and temples had always been white. Man can't do anything about it. It will take a revelation to get rid of in this new memory. So you're erasing from collective Latter-day Saint memory the Black priesthood holders and Black Latter-day Saint pioneers who complicate the white story. And in that moment, Latter-day Saints, I believe, are fully passing as white. It's their racial passage to whiteness. At the very same meeting in 1908, Joseph F. Smith decides that missionaries, quote, should not take the initiative in proselyting among the Negro people, but if Negroes or people tainted with Negro blood apply for baptism themselves, they might be admitted to church membership in the understanding that nothing further can be done for them. So deliberate decisions are being made there in 1908 that Latter-day Saints should not actively seek out Black converts. So you distance yourself from Blackness to claim whiteness. And it's no wonder, in my estimation, then that the Latter-day Saints or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints becomes known as a white church in the 20th century because they make deliberate decisions to stop seeking Black converts. So they go from not white enough in the 19th century to too white by the 21st century is basically the arc of the argument. And I just briefly, in the last chapter of the book, look at some examples to demonstrate this claim. As Mitt Romney ran for the presidency in the 21st century, a political blogger got a hold of the Romney Christmas card and poked fun of it. He said the Romney Christmas card represents a melting pot that is Utah. He actually photoshopped a Black man into the Romney family and said, well, who do you think is the non-Romney or nominee in this photo? But once again, making fun of the notion that Mormons are too white. And in fact, Lee Siegel in the New York Times published an editorial calling Romney the whitest white man to run for president in recent memory. Even though all US presidents up through President Obama had been white, Romney's Mormonism made him too white. So from not white enough in the 19th century to too white, and in the 19th century, you claim whiteness and distance from Blackness. And in the 21st century, the aspiration for Latter-day Saints is for a more racially diverse and international identity for themselves. And the I'm a Mormon media campaign in 2012 and 2013 is evidence of that. Those they chose to represent the 21st century faces of Mormonism were racially diverse and international. And it included, until she decided to seek public office, it included Mia Love with her white husband. So an interracial couple in the 21st century representing Mormonism in stark contrast to the political cartoons in the 19th century. So from not white enough to too white by the 21st century. And I'm going to leave it there and happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that excellent presentation. Super fascinating stuff. I'm excited to get on over to the discussion. So I think we will start with a question from our student, Eric.
Yeah, awesome. So Paul, I think you got answered a little bit of my question in the last few minutes of the presentation, but you mentioned that to the 21st century LDS Church, they're trying to fight a racial narrative of being too white, and that they're proactively trying to go out and say, well, look at how diverse we are. You have the I'm a Mormon campaign deliberately selecting racially diverse members of the church. And my question has to do with that, and perhaps going back to the 1800s, did a desire to fight against the racial identity of being non-white in the 1800s, did that perhaps actually affect or influence the doctrine of the church that was taught or interpreted by church leaders?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me be perfectly clear up front in trying to answer your question, Eric, that there's no smoking gun in terms of Latter-day Saint leaders saying, hey, the suggestion is that we're not white enough, and therefore we're going to put a racial priesthood and temple restriction in place to try to claim whiteness for ourselves. There are some smoking guns where Latter-day Saints in the 19th century actually articulate the fact that they are aware of the way that they're being denigrated as not white enough. So Parley P. Pratt, for example, a Latter-day Saint leader in the 19th century in Missouri, says, we're treated as if we were some colored race. And Heber C. Kimball says we're in Nauvoo in Illinois. So a little bit later than Pratt says we're constantly told that we're not worthy to live amongst white people. So they have that sense. They're aware of it. That's not just me as a 21st century historian sort of superimposing this whiteness study stuff on the 19th century. They are very much aware of it, as far as I can tell, or the sources substantiate that. So what I see taking place is sort of outsiders trying to ascribe this identity onto Latter-day Saints from the outside, and then sort of like two ships passing in the night, Latter-day Saints in fits and starts moving across the course of the 19th century, these efforts at claiming whiteness for themselves through their racial restrictions. So I believe it does have an influence on the policies that are put in place or the racial doctrines that are put in place in the 19th century. But do I have any Latter-day Saint leaders actually acknowledging that? No, I don't. Right. But I see Brigham Young in 1852 really in a couple of speeches he gives to the territorial legislature, really, I think, highlighting this fear of race mixing, fear of racial degeneration, and an effort at substantiating Latter-day Saint whiteness. So he's not explicitly saying, hey, outsiders are saying this about us, therefore I'm going to do this. But I think in the margins of those speeches, it's pretty clear what's taking place. And then it sort of takes on a life of its own across the course of the 19th century, and finally solidified in place under Joseph F. Smith. And remember, that's the height of racial segregation in the U.S. And I see deliberate decisions being made. So besides Joseph F. Smith, who's the leader of the Latter-day Saint faith at the time, and it's not just an internal decision made in Salt Lake City in 1908. He actually has that message distributed through missionary channels. Stop seeking Black converts. And you also have a letter that arrives from the Northern States Mission President in 1909, where he says to Salt Lake City, we have 3 Black families in the Northern States Mission, one in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, one in South Bend, Indiana, and one in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The problem is our missionaries bring white investigators to our worship services, and they don't want to stick around and worship in integrated congregations. My solution, the leader of the missionaries in the Northern States Mission at the time, he says, my solution, I have instructed my missionaries to stop proselyting in Black neighborhoods. So, you're valuing white converts over Black converts. You have integrated congregations, but white potential converts don't want to stick around and worship in integrated congregations. So the solution is stop seeking out Black converts. So I see those kind of decisions being made, and I think it definitely has an influence, that turn of the century passage to whiteness.
Thanks, Paul. I think our next question is from Erin.
Hi, I just want to say thanks for your presentation. So like Lydia mentioned earlier, we started this reading group as a way to apply the national conversation about anti-racism to our own local community. But the only reason we were able to do that is because there were 3 books published about the relationship between Mormonism and race in the last couple of years. So as one of those authors, what would you say was the impetus for this seemingly sudden scholarly interest in the racialization of Mormons in the 19th century? And what would you say we gained from contextualizing that history in this moment of increasing awareness of the social construction of race?
Yeah. So thanks for those questions, Aaron. So I guess, my motivation, a couple of motivations, I guess. The existing explanations. So I'm a scholar of Mormonism. So the existing explanations that were in circulation didn't really quite satisfy me in terms of how do you explain Latter-day Saint racial doctrines and policies in the 19th and 20th centuries. The existing explanations weren't ultimately satisfying to me. And then I had also just encountered a variety of whiteness studies. So, going back into the 90s, whiteness studies had largely suggested that immigrants like Irish and Italian immigrants weren't necessarily accepted as white. They had to go through this whiteness process. They were largely immigration and labor histories. And well, I should say that there are some Jewish whiteness studies as well. So that's sort of an ethnic/religious kind of component to it. But I was fascinated by those whiteness studies, and enough of my own research into Mormonism, I had come across things like Bartholow's Senate report in 1860. That's pretty curious, and started to pay attention to the ways that outsiders were ascribing a physically degenerate kind of identity onto Latter-day Saints. And so combine that primary source research with what I was noticing amongst the whiteness studies and said, there's something going on here. The real difference is it's not an immigrant, not necessarily merely an immigrant and labor story, but in fact, it's an insider religious group that is being denigrated as not white enough. So you're making outsiders out of the quintessential inside American religion. So that was sort of my motivation in engaging in this. And then, I work at a research institution and we have to publish. So I was looking for another project. And all of those things kind of came together, to start the project. I started in 2007. It took me 7 years to write. I wrote an application for a fellowship at the Huntington Library in California. They have a large Mormon collection of Protestant anti-Mormon tracts from the 19th century. And I thought, if this is really a thing, if this is really what's happening in the 19th century, I suspect that these Protestant tracts in the 19th century will bear this out. So I wrote this application. I got the fellowship. I spent the summer at the Huntington Library reading these tracts, and basically the categories for the chapters emerged from there, and then the political cartoons became a key component to that. So I guess those were the motivations. I think there was a second part to your question. I'm not sure if I got to it, Aaron.
Yeah. Go ahead, Lydia.
No, it's your question. Ask it.
I was just gonna add, the last part was just about how, what do you think we gain from contextualizing this racialization with the conversation about social construction of race that's going on right now?
Yeah, I think, I made the claim in the introduction to the book that telling the Mormon racial story is really telling the American racial story. And I knew that was maybe a pretty dramatic claim, but by the time I was done the research, I felt actually on solid ground with that claim. So I think we gained a deeper understanding of the way that race is profoundly a social construct. I mean, if this racialization can happen to predominantly white Latter-day Saints, right, then it should help us to take a step back and recognize the power that whiteness has played in American history and the profound racial moment that we are experiencing as a nation. I mean, I really feel like the Latter-day Saint racial story can really inform what's taking place in the present. I hope it lays bare the absolute absurdity of racial construction, and the way that we continue to engage in it. So that's my hope for the contextualization. I hope it can be a part of the ongoing dialogue, and that it can. I hope that it speaks to white people. I hope that my hope is that white people are willing to recognize. Then, more often than not, I see white people sometimes disengaging. That's not, they don't see white as a race. They don't see themselves implicated in what's taking place in the racial violence, any of those kind of things. That's someone else's issue. Race is black. Race is brown. Race is red. Race is whatever, but it's not white. And so my hope is that understanding sort of the power of whiteness in American history can cause white people like me to become invested in racial solutions, not just washing our hands of it.
Thanks so much. So we've got about 20 minutes or so, maybe a little less left. And I know there's a few more questions from the students. I'm just going to let those happen organically while I look on at the YouTube chat and see if we can pull any questions from there. So go ahead, whoever wants to go next.
Can I ask mine?
Yep.
So, hi, I'm Sarah. Here's my question. Considering that some of the early Mormon peculiarities or things that were different about them included the Book of Mormon, which is another, testament of Christianity, and the accompanying belief that people in the Book of Mormon are ancestors of indigenous people in the American continent, why was it the subject of polygamy that led to the racialization of 19th century Mormons? So in other words, why do you think it was polygamy and not any other Mormon peculiarities that got wrapped up in the 19th century discourse on race?
Yeah. So thanks for that question, Sarah. So let me say that the racialization actually took place before polygamy. Polygamy gave it a new life, and it just sort of took on a life of its own. So I think polygamy is really kind of a key moment. So Latter-day Saints openly acknowledge that they're practicing polygamy in 1852. It was a poorly kept secret before then. But they were denying it. So the first phase is a secret phase, right? And then in 1852, they just simply say, yeah, we're practicing it, and we believe it's protected under the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution. And it gives then the racialization new life. But the racialization was taking place actually in Missouri before polygamy was being practiced. So it is a factor. 1833, Latter-day Saints are accused of inviting free blacks to Missouri to incite a slave rebellion, but also to steal our white wives and daughters, was one of the charges leveled against them in Missouri before they are expelled from Jackson County. So that's before polygamy is a part of the Latter-day Saints. And also, the accusation was that Latter-day Saints are conspiring with Native Americans against true white Americans. They're becoming savages. They're aligning themselves with Native Americans to attack white Americans. Anytime that Latter-day Saints were driven from their homes, and I'm talking 1833, Jackson County, Missouri, I'm talking 1836, Clay County, Missouri, and then from the state of Missouri altogether in 1838, then from the state of Illinois, then the Utah War, when they're not driven from their homes, but nonetheless, military is sent against them. Every time there is the accusation that Latter-day Saints are conspiring with Native Americans against true white Americans. So, the other chapters in the book that we didn't talk about, there's 2 chapters on red, white, and Mormon. There's a chapter on Oriental, white, and Mormon. So those fears of race mixing are bound up in any Latter-day Saint expulsion, and it does predate polygamy. That sort of maybe contextualizes your question a little bit differently, but polygamy does give it sets off the imagination in new ways that wasn't there before Latter-day Saints openly announced polygamy. So the political cartoons, for example, that's really what they focus in on. And that becomes the best visual evidence, the imagined interracial families. But those imaginations were, there before polygamy was openly announced.
Thanks. I know I said I was going to prioritize student questions, and I know we have a couple more of those to go, but I just noticed a question from Professor Peter Coviello, who was the first speaker in this series over here on the YouTube live feed. And here's what he says. Thanks for this, Professor Reeve. A question in a few parts. Forgive this prolixity. I'm wondering about the claim that distance from Blackness is key to securing whiteness, though not because early Mormons did not look to distance themselves from Blackness. It seems rather that race, quote unquote, has never been merely a matter of lineage, phenotype, complexion, that comportments in gender, erotic life, and religiosity too have made up the inner grammars of what we call race. This suggests that distance from Blackness, that white supremacist racism, would indeed not be enough for the Mormons to secure their whiteness in as much as they were still polygamous. Does this sort of claim, the interweaving of sex and religiosity in the making of race, have a place in the story you want to tell about Mormonism and whiteness?
Yeah, I think so. So the examples that I use from Francis Lieber, for example, are in the last chapter of the book, Oriental White and Mormon. So he's imagining, not just Blackness, right? He's suggesting that because Latter-day Saints are practicing polygamy, they're more Asiatic than they are European, and they can't be European because monogamy is white in his estimation. And once again, the Supreme Court also uses that argument. So in other words, one way you claim whiteness for yourself is in giving up polygamy and transitioning from polygamy to monogamy. That's a part of the racial passage for Latter-day Saints as well. That's taking place at the turn of the 20th century. So Joseph F. Smith is called to testify in 1904 in the Reed-Smoot hearing before the United States Senate. And the question senators are asking is, have you actually abandoned polygamy? And we know that there are over 200 cases of post-manifesto polygamy. The manifesto is 1890. That's the beginning of the process of abandoning polygamy. It's obviously messy. Latter-day Saints go from monogamy to polygamy and back to monogamy in a 60-year time span. And those two bookends are wrenching for Mormonism. And the extraction out of polygamy into monogamy is a complicated process. And I think that's, the point of the question, if I'm understanding it correctly, right? That you have to rethink your sexuality and your marriage system. And that process is playing out as a part of claiming whiteness. I think the transition from polygamy to monogamy is an effort at securing whiteness for Latter-day Saints. So it's not merely distant from Blackness. That helps, in my estimation, to explain the temple restrictions. But the point is well taken. I think that transition from polygamy to monogamy is a part of the transformation to whiteness. Joseph F. Smith sort of ducks and dodges and weaves on the Senate witness stand, but returns to Salt Lake City, and on April 6, 1904, issues what's called the Second Manifesto, where he says, we really are giving up polygamy. We really mean it this time. And he puts teeth into the original manifesto, where Latter-day Saints start excommunicating anyone who engages in a future plural marriage. And that's a practice that they follow all the way to the present. Even though, they proselyte in countries that accept polygamy and aren't illegal. If you're to be baptized in the 21st century as a Latter-day Saint, you would have to divorce your plural wives. So, in other words, I think that's a part of claiming whiteness, is giving up polygamy and transitioning to monogamy, because monogamy has been defined as early as Francis Lieber in 1855 as the preserve of the white race.
Thank you. Let's take a couple more from the reading group if you're up for it. How about Sierra and then Nathan?
Sure. So my question, I feel like, has a lot of relevance to this question of distance from Blackness, specifically the literal distance. So in your book, you reference many specific steps that early Mormons took to claim their whiteness and assimilate into the national expectation of whiteness. How did their physical appearance of whiteness and largely Anglo-Saxon background affect their ability to assimilate and change the national perspective of their group, considering the difference in trajectory between governmental relationships with Mormons and governmental relationships with Native Americans and Black Americans, even up till now?
Yeah. So thanks, Sierra. So what I see taking place, like I mentioned, there are two chapters on red, white, and Mormon. So Latter-day Saints are imagining that intermarriage amongst Native Americans will bring Native Americans with them on their journey towards whiteness. It's a part of racial uplift for Native Americans. And they draw upon that new book of scripture, the Book of Mormon, where it talks about white and delightsome for a Native people. And so Brigham Young will actually, when he sends missionaries to missionize amongst Native Americans, encourage them to take Native American wives. The earliest interracial marriage to take place in a Latter-day Saint temple is between a white man and a Native American, Native American man and a white woman in Nauvoo. So those interracial marriages are seen as a part of Latter-day Saint racial uplift towards Native Americans. So the Mormon view is, well, we'll bring Native Americans with us in our journey towards whiteness, but intermarriage amongst African people of Black African descent will bring the racial curse upon us and make us ineligible for the priesthood, or our descendants ineligible for the priesthood. So we'll leave them behind. So you bring one group with you, the other group, it produces a racially degenerate curse, and you leave them behind in the way that the theology develops across the course of the 19th century.
Thanks, Paul. I think that actually segues really nicely into Nathan's question, if you're ready, Nathan.
I am, yeah. So you brought up how outsiders and critics of the Latter-day Saints ascribed racial degeneracy onto them. And I'm intrigued by the line that you take late in the first chapter of the book about how Mormons took up that argument and flipped it. How they argued that the monogamous overall society in the Americas was degenerate where they were actually the degenerate ones, and they used resources like the idea of believing blood and British Israelitism to bolster that case. I'm wondering, what do you think about this rhetorical strategy? How successful was it? How conscious is it on the part of Mormons to adapt this as a counter?
Yeah, I don't think it was very successful. I think it was, it was an effort. It demonstrates, in my estimation, that they are aware of the ways that outsiders are looking in on them and creating a degenerate, degraded Mormon body for them. And some scholars have read some of those Latter-day Saint leaders' speeches, for example, and said, well, wow, this is pretty curious. I think without understanding the way that outsiders are ascribing an identity for them, then you're not getting the full context for the way that Latter-day Saints are responding. And so, for example, I think, you might be referring to George Buchanan's speech. I was, pretty blown away by, his argument is that monogamy brings about the fall of Rome, and that polygamous societies are superior, right? So you're right. He does completely try to flip it. No one's buying it. No one's buying it. I mean, I think, he's trying to shore up his home audience and convince them and continue to justify polygamy. But there's no outsider really that he has brought along with him, or that Mormon claims when they are suggesting, hey, actually the product of polygamy is angelic, celestial, and divine, right? So the argument is over the outcome of polygamy, and I don't think any outsider is convinced by the Latter-day Saint arguments, even if they're paying attention at all. And I'm not even sure that they're listening to what the Latter-day Saints are saying. But it's not as successful. It may be successful in terms of helping to shore up those on the inside, but it certainly doesn't convince anyone on the outside.
Can I have a follow-up to that? I mean, so considering that it isn't a successful strategy rhetorically, and considering that, the Mormons are not, have proven that they're not shy or unable to break norms culturally, why do they continue to embed themselves in this kind of rhetoric about degeneracy and race? Why not, come with a stronger argument that no, this is all fake. This is all a construct that you're ascribing to us. Are they just too embedded in the cultural context?
Yeah, I think it's because of how race is constructed in the 19th century, and I think they're just it's a part of their cultural understanding of this. So it's not until later that you're going to have people sort of arguing for a social construct, and I think it's the way that they are viewing race in the 19th century. They're participating in that cultural milieu that they are immersed in. It's a fraught, illogical, and fluid racial context in the 19th century, and they are a part of it.
Thanks. I think we've got at least one more question from Evan, and then we'll see how Paul's doing, if he's ready for more.
Yeah, thanks again for your presentation, Dr. Reeve. I enjoyed it. So as I was reading Religion of a Different Color, the descriptions of Latter-day Saints by people in the 19th century kind of reminded me a lot of the ways that I hear 21st century fundamentalist Latter-day Saints be described. So the FLDS, obviously many adherents of which still practice polygamy today kind of are seen as having a certain look, and they're certainly made fun of a lot for what they wear and for their perceived physical characteristics. So I'm kind of wondering if you've seen in your research that some folks stereotypes of FLDS appearances has had a negative effect overall on how people view the FLDS people, and has deriding the stereotypical appearances of FLDS people ever been used as a tactic by members of the church the mainstream LDS church in an effort to distance themselves from fundamentalist groups?
Yes. Yeah. So in admittedly brief and broad brushstroke concluding chapter, I do talk about a couple of examples. So when Warren Jeffs, who's the leader of the FLDS group on the Utah-Arizona border, when he was arrested, but also when there was the raid in Texas on the FLDS community in Texas, I saw a couple of things take place. So the head of the LDS Church's PR department in Texas issued a statement trying to distinguish between members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And really, you sort of, I read it as kind of this plea, hey, don't conflate us with them. And one line in this PR statement was, they don't look like us. They dress differently than us. So, it's back to that, how they look kind of physical argument. Don't conflate them with us. We don't look like that. We don't dress like them, that kind of a thing. And then sort of more a, sort of social media kind of thing that took place around the same time. I think probably, I did a minor in folklore. And so, you sort of don't know where these things come from, but, emerging from Latter-day Saints in the pew, someone puts this together and then it gets just shared in email groups and those kind of things. And this appeared in my email inbox one day, and it was basically, once again, trying to distinguish as the FLDS were making national news. It was Latter-day Saints trying to distinguish who they were from FLDS. And so it included, a variety of famous Latter-day Saints that Americans would recognize. So people like Steve Young, Gladys Knight, those kind of things. And, Donny Osmond, Marie Osmond, so the email sort of went through and it had a picture of all these famous Latter-day Saints. You might not know, but, Latter-day Saints look like this and look like this and look like this, but none of the Latter-day Saints I know looks like this. And then it's a picture of FLDS women being hauled off, and Warren Jeffs in a prison jumpsuit and handcuffs. None of the Latter-day Saints I know look like this. The prairie dress, the distinct hairstyle, those kind of things. So once again, zeroed in on physical appearance as a distinguishing factor. So you're right on target. Your instincts are right on target.
Thanks. We've got one question I just noticed in the YouTube live stream from a student named David. I'm not sure if this is outside of the scope of the book or the presentation, but he's wondering about the similarities and differences between the race story for Jewish people and the Mormon story of race that we've just talked about. Do you see any similarities, and what would demarcate the Mormon story as being the quintessentially American story?
Yeah, so the Jewish story, so I believe, so don't hold me to this, I believe last name is Goldstein. The book is The Price of Whiteness, is one of the Jewish whiteness studies. And I actually, cite that in Religion of a Different Color and use his sense that whiteness comes with a certain cost. And his argument amongst Jewish immigrants is that there is this cost that comes in terms of that distance from other racial groups. And so you pay a price for claiming whiteness for yourself. And I think for Latter-day Saints, I make that case in the book that Latter-day Saint whiteness comes at a significant cost. Here we are in the 21st century, trying to deconstruct sort of the power of whiteness in Latter-day Saint memory and history and culture, and still dealing with, racist teachings amongst Latter-day Saints in the pew, the cost of Black Latter-day Saints, So I think the Jewish example, at least in that book, The Price of Whiteness, really parallels well with the price of whiteness amongst Latter-day Saints. And then I would say the distinction is, once again, the Jewish whiteness studies that I've seen, at least, are once again immigrant stories, immigration from Europe into America. And some of what I talk about in Religion of a Different Color is also immigration from Northern and Western Europe. So that's the chapter 1. But nonetheless, you could still be born in America and convert to Mormonism. You could be, had you not converted to Mormonism, be seen at the top of the racial hierarchy in the 19th century, but conversion to Mormonism as an American would then push you down the racial hierarchy and make your race suspect. So that's a distinction that comes immediately to mind between the Jewish whiteness studies.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Reeve. I think we're going to go ahead and wind down here. I want to remind those of you watching on YouTube that this is part of an ongoing speaker series. I'm going to go ahead and include a link to the information for that broader series in the YouTube chat, where you can also watch eventually a replay of this event, as well as the first event with Peter Coviello. And I think the brief exchange between Professors Coviello and Reeve gives us a taste of what I think will be a truly enriching and important conversation among all of our speakers at a roundtable panel at the end of the spring. So I do encourage all of you to take a look at the speaker series information, try to attend the other events when you can, and look out for more information about that roundtable event. I want to thank Lydia once again for helping put all of this together, and of course our distinguished guest, Paul Reeve. So silent Zoom clap, there we go, yes. And this was a truly enlivening and fascinating conversation. I feel very fortunate to have been a part of it. And I thank all of you students for your wonderful questions, and all of you spectators at home for your attendance and participation. Please stay safe and well, and we will see you again very soon.